Welcome! Today I'm going to run through Salmonid Smokeyard, a salmon run map that was introduced in Splatoon 2 and has returned in Splatoon 3. This advice is quite generalist and doesn't cover high-end gameplay or overfishing. It's just some advice from a freelance addict that hopefully makes you appreciate this map a little more and learn how to use it to your advantage. When this map was announced that it'd be coming to Splatoon 3, there was a notable divide between casual players or those less experienced and overfishers or freelance warriors. Those that hated this map really hate it, and those that loved it thought, well, it was one of the easiest maps in Splatoon 2, let's see how Splatoon 3 treats it. Salmon Run in Splatoon 3 is harder than Splatoon 2. This is worth stating immediately from the beginning. The hazards are higher, there's new bosses that are oppressive, and the lessers are way more aggressive. With all that in mind, it's worth recognising that Smokeyard was built with mechanics from Splatoon 2 in mind and not Splatoon 3. They didn't adapt it at all, unfortunately, but that's an opinion for another time. The main thing to remember is that this map was easier in Splatoon 2 because Splatoon 2 was easier. Smokeyard might be difficult now because Salmon Run overall is more challenging. So let's talk about a few things you can do. Number 1. Normal tide. The lifts are unique to Smokeyard. I'm sure we've all been caught off guard by a teammate using the lift and you're either not intended to go with them or you've just missed the jump and landed in the water. I'll talk about high tide on this map in a separate point, but generally my best advice for normal tide is to more or less ignore these as the majority of bosses do not spawn near them. A way to utilise them is when needing to get to further statics, but you shouldn't be using the other island during normal tide as bosses spawn either to the left or to the right of them. The only exception here is drizzlers, but they eventually jump closer. It's worth painting the other side to aid with movement, but generally for normal tides you won't be needing the lifts much or needing to stay on the other island much. Another major point for normal tide is to paint all the walls you can. These are helpful for movement and safety and should be painted every time you roll a normal tide. They give you so much more freedom with moving around the map, so it's worth repeating. Paint as many walls as your weapon allows. Even if it's just small lines, it will help if you need to move quickly, trust me. Number 2, high tide. This is probably going to be the longest portion because I believe this is where most people have their grievances. The two islands separated by lifts are small, have barely any safety and can be chaotic. They are open and relatively flat, meaning you don't have any designated safe spaces you could use to take a breather. What this should tell you, which might not be intuitive if you've not played the game long, is that this means you need to be more aggressive with your killing. There is absolutely zero need to lure on this map, outside of bringing spawns from the other island closer to the basket, but even then, I would caution against this if you're in freelance or playing at hazards you're not comfortable with. On high tide, you will have no issues reaching quota, but you will have lots of issues staying alive if you don't kill quickly enough. Killing things early to keep the basket area safe is especially important if you feel disadvantaged for a certain reason, such as you have a slow weapon, you're a player down, or you've got no specials left. I would be extremely hesitant to leave anything alive for more than one cycle unless you're in a very controlled game with players you trust. In terms of venturing to the other island on Smokeyard, it's ideal to have a player or two to work over there and throw eggs back. You can work on a 1-3 or 2-2 split. This is harder to manage in freelance, but you'll need to see where your teammates are struggling and follow that. If statics on the other island are ignored, go deal with them. If a player is already on the other island dealing with them, you could focus on the basket island to run eggs and help control the spawns there. I would go and support them if they keep dying or they're struggling to efficiently manage the statics. Specials like Whale, Inkjet and Triple Ink Strike are really effective for dealing with those statics quickly and shouldn't put you in much danger either, so this is a way you could help deal with statics while staying on the basket island. The main takeaway point here is to be flexible with islands for high tide, especially in higher hazards. You'll need to bounce between both islands to control static spawns and to help keep the basket clear. You need to be aggressive and not leave things alive too long, as the islands are too small to navigate when things become chaotic. It's also worth talking about throwing eggs and snatchers for high tide too. The snatchers could help bring any extra eggs over from the other island, so it's also worth keeping an eye out for which direction they're coming from. If they don't appear to help you much, you can throw eggs from the other island directly into the basket, but this takes some practice and relies on it being safe to do so. More often than not, especially in Freelance, it's not worth outstaying your welcome and dying on the other island. It can be hard for your team to cope with a player down, and they'll be forced to stop taking an aggressive position and come to your rescue. Go to the other island, deal with the bosses and get some eggs back, but be mindful of risking too much for one more egg. Number 3. Lifts. With the lifts, you'll need to be careful not to kill or be killed. For the lift by the basket island, be mindful of bombs or explosions causing a ricochet and sending the lifts flying. Be mindful of joining friends if they've already started shooting the fan. For the fan by the opposite island, you can use a bomb to bring it closer, or if you have a longer range weapon, you can shoot it to bring it closer. Generally, I try to avoid staying on the other island if I don't have to, so I often use the same lift to return, or I quickly escape and do not wait. You can make a jump from the grates on the far island to the platform if you've just missed your ride back and you can't wait. Another way to navigate these islands on high tide is to use the fish stick that spawns in the water in between both islands. You'll have another option to move across the islands that usually doesn't interfere with the game the way the lifts do. Just be careful that a Moors isn't following you and completely disrupts your movement. I also think it's worth mentioning another property that the lifts have that may not be as well known. They work as a de-aggro space that will remove a boss chasing you. This is also how the lifts in Marina's Bay work too. The two bosses that get de-aggroed from you are steel eels and grillers. All other bosses are not affected by this. This can be extremely helpful if you're in a position where you're being chased by an eel and need it to go past you rather than for you, so you can kill it easier. But I caution using this platform for this reason without a good cause. The eel will go for somebody else and you may well disrupt your teammates' game plan, which could cause their death. Generally, you want to avoid bringing more than one eel close to the basket anyway, as they take up way too much space. But if you're a weapon like a charger or a splatling and you need a moment to charge your weapon, then using the platform to de-aggro the eel may prove helpful. Number 4. Low tide. There isn't much to discuss here, as generally low tide is pretty straightforward and doesn't use any of the lifts or have any of the platforms. It's flat and every new spawn can be easily seen from any place in the map. Specials like whale, ink strike, inkjet and crab benefit from the open and flat layout of low tide and should be used when statics begin to pile up. Something that is worth mentioning here is that the stinger that spawns on the middle platform at the back that is separated by two grates on either side can be easily reached from the basket area with certain weapons. If you don't have the range, bombs can also reach. Number 5. General advice. There's a couple of things I want to mention before getting to the final point, and they aren't specific to any wave type or situation. The lessers are extremely problematic in Splatoon 3, more so than the previous game. Their movement is faster and they react to players quicker, meaning it's easier to die to them. They also paint better, so slowly over the course of a wave, the walls and areas you painted will be stained with green as they move around. It's very important to be aware of lessers and their impact on a wave, and keeping on top of them will ensure better movement and thus better results. Do not underestimate the ability of lessers to completely disrupt your game, especially on a small map like Smokeyard. Bosses like Salmonids and fish sticks are two bosses that need to be taken care of quickly to help decrease the impact that lessers have on you and your team. Weapon roles are also important to recognise when playing, and it's worth noting what your weapon does well and what your weapon cannot do well. Personally, I feel Smokeyard is extremely punishing to slower weapons, and I wonder if this is where the general dislike for Smokeyard comes from. You don't really have a safe spot to work from, and on high tide it might feel like you're not able to safely charge your weapon without being smacked by something. Therefore, faster, automatic weapons tend to fare better on Smokeyard. If you're playing a shooter or a fast or lightweight weapon, be mindful of the stress your teammates with slower weapons might be under, and help support them with paint, lesser control, and generally keeping the basket safe. Number 6. Night waves. Generally, night waves such as Mudmouse, Mothership, Sea King and Tornado are relatively easy and are not too distinguished from other maps. Fog and cohort charge are also more or less the same as regular waves with small differences, and generally the way I play them doesn't differentiate too much. For this reason, I won't discuss them and would rather discuss the two night waves that most people struggle with: glowflies and grillers. For glowflies, or rush, the ideal place to stand is to the right of the basket. During normal tide, you should ensure all the walls around the back of the platform are painted, as this will guarantee you safety if you need it. Ideally, you don't want to stall unless you don't have a choice, but the painted walls are there in case you need to. For high tide, the same place is still ideal, but you'll need to be careful as the back walls will be limited. You can still use the walls if they're painted, but I wouldn't rely on this. Taking an aggressive position and having the horde all come through the same choke point is the best way to get through. The other island is there if you're desperate, but if you've got to use specials to survive, then do so. For grillers, the ideal space to stand if you're targeted is at the basket but towards the back left. This ensures that the griller is brought closer to the basket but also gives you safety and height advantage to help with stunning and defeating them. If you're not targeted, consider taking a position opposite to where the griller is being led so that you can stun it. Grillers is harder during high tide as you have much less room and the grillers might come at you faster than you anticipated. The lifts will take the grillers off of you if you're targeted, but as mentioned before, be careful with doing this as this can cause chaos. I'd recommend doing it if you're a high DPS weapon that can easily stun grillers or you're a weapon that needs charging. Like Rush, you'll need to keep up an aggressive slaying of the enemies rather than playing defensively and stalling. And use your specials if you need to, please, regardless if it's the first wave or not. I tried my best to condense this as much as possible, so I may have missed some stuff. Smokeyard is unique in a lot of ways, and I appreciate why people don't like it. This advice mostly comes from my years of playing this map relentlessly in Freelance, and it's just my opinion. I hope the video helps you appreciate Smokeyard a bit more, or at the very least, tolerate it. Also, I apologise for my voice sounding a bit off. I lost my voice last month, and it's struggling a little bit. But anyway, let me know what you think. I will see you guys soon.